Dumisani Washington. A warm welcome to Johnny Gould's Jewish State.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're the founder and CEO of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. So let's go back into your early life, a religious life, which I guess has had a big effect on you on this journey to becoming a man.
Singularly, probably nothing more important than spiritually. So there's a spiritual and a cultural element to it. The spiritual one would be becoming a Christian at a very young age. I was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, and my parents were very involved in the church, as was not uncommon in the South at that time, particularly for Black families. Faithful members of King Solomon Baptist Church in North Little Rock, Arkansas. And that's how I grew up. My father was a deacon and a choir member. My mother was a matron and a youth worker, and I was what we call church babies. We were there all the time, 6 days a week, from the time I was a little child. So that's how I grew up. But even more so than the actual church part of it, I always, from the time I was very young, because I professed faith in Jesus at a very young age. It just did. My parents, they weren't ogres in that sense. We went to church a lot, right? But they weren't overly religious in the sense that they made us do this or made us do that. We had to get saved. We had to say these things. And then they bought us Bibles. And I probably read the Old Testament more than the New Testament. I didn't know the difference as a child. So I became quite enamored by the time I was in grade school. I was captivated by the stories of Israel, whether it's the patriarchs, David and Goliath, the prophets. These things, they fascinated me. So I saw them in my mind. I saw these characters and these things playing out. Didn't know what that actually was. So that was probably the biggest shape in terms of where Israel was concerned, though not the geopolitical reality that is Israel, but definitely in a spiritual sense. So yes, sir.
Yeah, I was also brought up in a synagogue community and by extension a primary school. And obviously when we're little children, we learn things parrot fashion, and then the learning gets a little bit more advanced a little bit later on in childhood too. But you're also a graduate of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. So your background in music, and particularly gospel music, I'm imagining, has also had a bit of a profound effect on your religiosity.
Absolutely. So that was the other part of that story, that not only was I born, if you will, in church, not literally in the building, but obviously born into that reality. What was also the case was that I was musically gifted. My parents, my father was as well. He was a singer, as I said, but a very accomplished one back in those days. In the when he was coming up, TV was a thing, but it wasn't the main medium. Actual radio still was. So he had a group that he was a part of. They would travel around the parts of the South, and they would go to radio stations back in that day, and you would sing live at the radio stations. He was the youngest. He was his late teens, early 20s, and the rest of the guys in the group were in their 30s and 40s. And this is how accomplished he was. And so I got his music gene. I'm not the singing part. I sing okay, but I'm a pianist. And so
Great.
I started
Yes.
playing at a very young age. And because we were in church, I started playing in church at a very young age, playing for the choirs, playing for Sunday school, playing for special events. So yes, the music part of that for me, along with obviously it's part of the spiritual part as well, was a huge factor in how I saw things. Negro spirituals are part of what shaped American music, not just the Black American experience, but American music as a whole.
And talking of spirituals, I always feel there's a real hop and a skip, just a really close relationship between soul music and gospel music. The only difference being what soul music sings about: love affairs and push me, pull me relationships and struggles in that way, as opposed to godly talk. I mean, when you listen to Aretha Franklin bellowing such beautiful soul music. I mean, that really is the kind of difference, isn't it? It must have been a bit of a tension between the religious people and the secular in black soul music.
Yes, absolutely. It was part of the controversy as it was during that time. Now I'm the 70s because I'm a child. I'm coming up. I'm not aware of it on that intellectual level, but I'm living in and experiencing it, right? I didn't know Aretha Franklin personally, but I knew that style of music, gospel, spirituals, and those types of things. It was interesting that just like rock and roll and R&B came out of the whole Negro spirituals. This is all kind of a line. A music oncology, if you will, type of thing. What you have then is this gospel style, this belting out, this mournful and even also celebratory thing that was often rooted in the Old Testament. That's where the spirituals came from. Go down Moses, Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. So that same ethos continued on into the modern era, right? You know, how, my soul looks back and wonder how I got over. That was one of the songs that Aretha Franklin made famous. So what happened was, obviously within the rock and roll and what became the soul music genre outside of church, some of the controversy inside of the church with the leaders was that style, which was a sacred style to them, being now taken and used in other venues. And that's always the push and pull. None of that is new. I remember I studied again at the conservatory. That was a controversy during Bach's time. He was an ardent Christian, but his music would be played in different venues and different people felt different ways about that. So nothing new under the sun as it goes.
Indeed, I can hear the ghosts of Ashkenazi tunes from synagogue in some pop music. The Everly Brothers have one or two songs, and I look down the publisher notes and see if the writers have got Jewish surnames to think, oh yeah, I heard that on Shabbos, I'll take that. Indeed, there was a hit a few years ago where the lyrics were taken straight out of church and then put into a soul music song, and it starts with "Take the shackles off my feet so I can dance. I just want to praise you. I just want to praise you." I mean, that's straight out of church, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I know that song. There was a big hit about maybe 20 years ago or so. So yeah, absolutely. That was often the case. It was the Edwin Hawkins singers made "Oh Happy Day." "Oh Happy Day" was a big hit in the 70s. It was actually an old hymn. They just took the hymn and they redid the music, obviously, right? So people didn't know it was actually him, that it existed beforehand. But it became not just in the gospel music, they played it on secular radio and it blew up. I think it went to the top of the charts, right? So "Oh Happy Day when Jesus washed my sins away." You had people, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and atheists singing "Happy Day when Jesus washed
Yes,
my
I
sins
hear
away."
you.
This is
Really
actually
nice. Yes.
happening because of the genre of the music. It was so captivating that people just gravitated to it.
And when the Jews arrived in the United States between 120 and 150 years ago, of course, they brought the clarinet with them. And I always feel that there's a relationship between klezmer music and jazz music from the Mississippi Delta. There's a real melange of American music in the 20th century. And there's another thing, this might be a blunt comparison, but there are similarities, aren't there, between the pure joy of Hasidism and that of the gospel church?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is part of what we find. The further back you go into the Black church experience, the more you see both thematically and musically what you are describing. Even in terms of older Black church, you would sometimes have the women on one side, men on one side, which would be a very, very, well, almost ultra orthodox way of actually congregating within the synagogue, right? And then you have a call and response as well. I remember, I don't have access to it right now, but I remember sharing with people. There was this gentleman happened. He was a cantor whose family had returned from Israel, from Iraq, from the Babylonian captivity, if you will, and he was singing Hebrew lyrics in a very Middle Eastern style. And as he was singing, he would sing and it would be a call and response. It was very eerily similar to what happens in the Black church, where we have what's called the old 100s. There'd be a cantor. We didn't call him a cantor. He was the song leader or whatever, maybe a deacon. He would sing a line from a psalm, and everyone else would sing it behind him after he sang it the exact same way, right? So you again, the further back you go, the more you see that liturgical style as well as the music and everything.
Indeed, it's called the additional service. There's Musaf, and then there is the toing and froing between the chazan, the cantor, the rabbi, and the community, and even a way that you have to stand in a certain way. And I'm really loving this conversation. It's really, really uplifting, and I can hear the music in the discussion we're having as we go along. But then you made the transition from your musical career as a pianist to being a full-time educator, preacher, and pastor. And I'm guessing actually that they really came together, and it seemed like an inevitable move in your life.
Yes, yes, it did. It actually did. So my first trip to Israel was in December of 2012. And I was a guest pastor with Christians United for Israel as part of their African American pastors tour. And by then, obviously, I was already deep love for Israel. There was also an Africa element to that as well. There was another parallel trek that I was going through, navigating. And so, love for Africa, love for Israel. There, I'm at the Western Wall, and I have one of the most deeply moving experiences I've ever had, and came away from that experience feeling an urgent need to do something that would strengthen the ties between the Black and Jewish community and between Israel and Africa. As a mandate, if you will. This was as much of a burning bush moment as I'd ever experienced. And I tried to make sense of it as much as I could. And when I returned to the States, later on in 2013, we founded the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. One of the things that inspired IBSI was a 1975 organization started by Black Americans called the Black BASIC. That's an acronym for Black Americans to Support Israel Committee, started by Dr. King's family and his former colleagues. Obviously, he'd been assassinated already. By Rustin A. Philip Randolph, Coretta Scott King, the father, the King Sr. All these were members, as well as many, many other Black Americans from different genres, different walks of life. And they did it. They formed the organization to both push back on the anti-Semitism that was coming out of the United Nations specifically, but also to defend what they called the historic Black struggle for justice within the United States, because Zionism was being labeled as racism back then in the 1970s.
Because there are some really beautiful pictures of the solidarity between African Americans and Jewish people in the 50s and 60s. There's those classic pictures of Martin Luther King standing with a rabbi holding the Torah in the South. But in recent years, in the last decade, there's been a schism that's grown between the two communities, and that's Black Lives Matter. And I'm not just saying that that's an experience that we've seen in America, it's also over here, where the working class of the whites and the Black people, particularly where I was growing up in Birmingham, has been pulled apart slightly by this. I mean, we had a great ska and reggae movement of two-tone, and they had a black and white checker, which meant literally the black and the white, black and white unite. And that's not the same now. I mean, I take it that really your work is more important than ever because of that.
I agree to a certain degree. So obviously BLM, and we've talked about that quite a bit with our organization. We've made videos about it, and people can go on our website and check it out, and they can read some articles that we've written about it over the years. BLM has been problematic from the beginning in terms of its messaging, purposely conflating anything that would even seem to do with civil rights, particularly when it comes to the Black community, conflating that and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which was intentional. The only reason I gave a caveat in terms of I agree almost completely is that BLM, as we make clear in our writings, in our speeches, and everything, their target was not the Black community any more than the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, that their target was to help the Palestinian people. Obviously, Yasser Arafat, PLO, their goal was to exploit the Palestinian people in order to demonize and destroy Israel. This is the same thing with BLM, a very similar thing. Their point was to use Black faces, to use Black jargon, if you will, especially in terms of civil rights, in order to paint Israel as evil, as genocidal, as racist, as settler colonialists and imperialists and all of those things. That was their goal. And again, when I say the target wasn't the Black community, their target was everyone else. And there's many, many different examples of that. And one of them I'll use for the sake of time is college campus. BLM, like other anti-Israel groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, Muslim Student Association, their focus then on the campuses was to turn the hearts and minds of the students. Obviously, of course, they're working in concert with certain faculty and funding and all those types of things. But if you notice, most of those campuses were predominantly white. In other words, if their focus was black students, why not go to historically black colleges and universities? Why not flood the campuses of Howard and Spelman? Answer to that question is because that wasn't their goal. Their goal was everyone, regardless of their ethnicity, but particularly those who would become the movers and shakers and the leaders later on. So they presented anti-Israel sentiment as a social justice movement that people would want to latch onto. The vast majority of Black Americans still remain pro Israel, but the problem is that their voices aren't actually heard. What the voices are heard are very anti Israel ones, like the Louis Farrakhan's, or like in the past, the Reverend Al Sharptons and that type of thing. That became the dominant narrative coming towards the media, which actually presented that as a narrative, but unfortunately wasn't a correct narrative. I hope that makes sense.
Very much so. And this schism just plays into the hands of our enemies, Qatar and Iran, possibly Russia and China. And I'm just wondering how much of a relationship you think there is between BLM and Iran and how they're promoting this division in the West.
Ideologically, they are completely in sync. It's funny. I was doing an interview last week, and I brought something up that I'm going to bring up now, and I realized that I hadn't finished the whole thought. So if anyone saw those, they would see this and connect the dots. Iran, since the revolution of 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran, working together with obviously the Palestinian leadership like Yasser Arafat and the others, has targeted the Black community in that way specifically. To this day, right now, as we sit, the Islamic Republic of Iran is recruiting young Black Americans and Black Africans to become Shia clerics in Tehran. They literally take them to Tehran. They study there for 7-8 years, and then they send them back to their homes, right, to be Shia clerics of their brand of Islamist Islam, right? They're in there, whether it's a Michigan, whether it's a Nigeria. This is happening right now. And I connect that purposefully to what BLM does, because what BLM does, in the same type of way, ideologically attempts to capture people. It comes in like a Trojan horse and says, we're concerned about civil rights. We're concerned about racism. We're concerned about police brutality. Oh, and by the way, free Palestine. What do those two things have to do with each other? Absolutely nothing. But what it does is it plays on the lack of knowledge about what's going on in the Middle East, and it also, in a very nefarious way, plays on the emotions of, if you're going to go to family and community members in which someone has been shot, regardless of what the circumstances have been, and here the blood is still warm on the ground, and you want to talk about how Israel is shooting Palestinians. First of all, those two things have nothing to do with each other. Secondly, that's a very heinous thing for someone to do, to exploit the emotions of what's actually going on. So BLM and Iran, they're very much similar in that. And I'll connect to Louis Farrakhan, who was in Iran just a few years ago, helping lead Chance of Death to America, right? So this is what we're actually dealing with. It has nothing to do with Black liberation, nothing to do with independence, nothing to do with moving forward. It has everything to do with hating Israel, hating America, hating the West, and it becomes a self-destructive ideology.
And whenever I discuss Islamic extremism through the ages, it seems to shapeshift into different ideas, different cultures. You know, there was the 1970s, a sort of pan-Arab communism, and now there's much more religious jihadism about it. And so if you go back to Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay's conversion to Islam, it's really quite different in texture to the conversion to Islam today. It was a kind of American nationalism, wasn't it?
It wasn't. I think that there's nuance there, and it's a very, very fascinating topic. So he was a very much of a, in the traditional style of a Black nationalist, like a Malcolm X, whom he was friends with, right? So he had a lot to say about what he would call white America, and of course, racism and structural racism and that type of thing. Of course, he famously refused to fight in the Vietnam War because he said he's not going to fight the quote unquote white man's war. So you definitely had that tension there, and he based it on his Islam, right? This was part of what he was actually saying. I think that if there's any difference between then and now, is that it's much more, it meaning the whole ethos is much more visceral now. Now, what you have is, along with what would have been a more militant idea of his, It's funny, one of his best friends was Billy Crystal, a Jewish man who's very proud of his Jewishness, right? So you definitely had a lot of goodwill that was there, even with the Muhammad Ali, because he was looked at by many people. They admired him, even if they didn't agree with him. They admired his stance and his ability and his willingness to say what he thought. Here, it's today. I think that we're in a much more dangerous place in that there is an anti-Semitism that exists today in the West and in the United States that did not exist like it did then about 40, 50 years ago, in terms of what's everything from the campuses to social media to Jews being attacked on the streets because of Gaza, so on, so on and so forth. I believe we're in a much more dangerous situation here. And there's a lot of the scapegoating that's happening here, right? You have the Kanye West, who's also somewhat mentored by, or at least had a deep relationship with Louis Farrakhan, right? Who's praising the Nazis, right? And who's praising, or other people who are praising the type of attacks that are happening after October the 7th. This type of thing, you didn't see it like that where Muhammad Ali and some of those people were concerned back then. I think we're in a very, very difficult and dangerous place today.
Because as we know, Dumisani, any society which tolerates anti-Semitism and some even practicing it really is a measure of the decline of that society. And we're seeing that here in the UK, where you are in the US, Canada, Australia. How do we hold this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that what we are seeing here, and I'll just make this specifically where the US is concerned, we are seeing, as you said, the breakdown of our society in ways, and of course, there's other issues you can point to, but as you said, um, Jew hatred, anti-Semitism, which is also anti-Zionism in that sense, is an indication that something has gone dreadfully wrong within that society. And when it specifically in the Black community, any vestige of it is always a deeper sign. There are reasons why the Black and Jewish communities for over a century have found each other in terms of that type of solidarity. Not just the civil rights movement, go back even further to Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald at the beginning of the 20th century, the Rosenwald schools, that synergy, how that actually happened. Jews who fled Nazi Europe, who came to the States and were professors and could not find work in some of the other mainline universities, taught in historically Black colleges and universities because there's an understanding of that shared experience of being marginalized and being the other. So it could be easily said, and Dr. King did say this, that the Black person, he said, and I can almost quote him, he said, anti-Semitism is something of an anathema within the Negro community, he said, because he understands what that type of race hatred is. So it was almost non-existent in the 60s, like I said before. The thing that shifted from there coming forward was the type of KGB disinformation that was targeted to use the Black community for this very purpose, to call Israel, to affix onto Israel any type of negative thing that someone would say about a Jewish person. And I'm talking about that now. I'm talking about some sort of blood libel, right? This is what Israel became. And this is unfortunately what we are seeing descend here in the United States. Israel then becomes the whipping post for anyone who has a problem with Jews, any type of blood libel. The Jews are doing this, the Jews are doing that. No matter how salacious it is, it doesn't matter how fraudulent it is, it becomes believable to those who've already drank the poison of anti-Semitism.
And your book, Zionism and the Black Church. Anyone who's watching, listening, do go check it out on Amazon. It's like a testimony. It's like a manifesto for your work, isn't it?
We attempt to, in the book, through history, through music, all these things, explain the deep, deep ties between the Black and Jewish communities, even going all the way back to the Africa-Israel summit. The first Africa-Israel summit was when the Queen of Sheba traveled hundreds of miles to visit Solomon in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago, right? We talk about the significance of that visit, what it actually meant, but even more immediately here in the United States, the book attempts to explain what that connection is, why it has been so crucial, whether spiritually, even geopolitically. Even Dr. King was going to kick off what was going to be even Christian tours to the Holy Land before he was assassinated. Literally, he was planning a mass pilgrimage of Black Americans to the Holy Land. Why all of those things were significant, why it was happening in that way, and why it then is so important that not just Black Americans, but in the African diaspora, understand that what we call that highway to Zion, that what that actually means, why it's so important, and why Israel's enemies and Africa's enemies have tried so hard over the years to completely destroy that connection. That's part of the indication that it's something that is powerful, that is synergistic, and that needs to be protected generation after generation so that people can truly understand and see the world is a better place in that way. When the civil rights movement in its purest form, if I can say it that way, was an inspiration to the world about how you don't get to just treat another people because of their color of their skin or because of their ethnicity or because of their religion in some sort of demi or Jim Crow way. It was an inspiration to people around the world. When the education efforts of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald happened on a grassroots level, having nothing to do, there was no government intervention or anything, but these men came together to solve this problem. It was an inspiration to people around the world. There's a reason why our communities have inspired people around the world.
Amen and amen. So I did some reading on this recently, and when Moses said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," in Egypt, among the Israelite slaves that he pled with and actually managed to escape in like a moonlight flit across the sea, there were some African slaves that went with them as well. I mean, among the tribe that escaped to Israel, there is a big African contingent even today. So I think that we are probably more closely related than some might think.
The ties go back very, very deep. Of course, there was in the book of Numbers, it talks about Moses' Ethiopian wife Zipporah, and their controversy with his siblings, where that was concerned. You have what we call, I talk about in my book, this continual connection between the lines of Shem and the lines of Ham over and over and over again in a way that is undeniable even in the scriptures. So you have it's funny, even Abraham's servant Eleazar was a Cushite. And so this connection even goes back in terms of its friendship back to Father Abraham. So all throughout the history, it's funny, Israel becomes a nation in Sinai, which is Egypt, which is Africa. You have Africans and Hebrews mourning the death of Jacob, and they go and bury him. I shared before that my daughter-in-law, who just passed away in January, when she passed away, she's from South Africa, a very staunch Zionist, beautiful young lady, Olga. She passed away during the Torah reading, which was, I believe, Vayaki, which is the one in which Jacob dies. And Jacob is then mourned by these Africans, right? These Egyptians and Hebrews march to Zion, quote unquote. They go to Canaan to bury his body. And the mourning was so great. The Canaanites said they called it the mourning of Egypt because they saw all of these Egyptians crying for this Hebrew patriarch. So you're talking about, yes, deep, deep ties. This is, again, long before you get to Solomon and Sheba. You're talking about centuries before any of those things. This has always been the case, that these two have been joined at the hip somewhat. The land of Ham, as the Bible calls Africa, right? That the gift coming out of the land of Ham to Zion is what God has declared over and over again. So yes, there are very, very deep ties. That it's funny when we're talking about that, you're talking about Israel's first official diplomatic relationship was with an African nation. None of that was happenstance, right? No other foreign nation had traveled to Jerusalem to befriend Israel and the Jewish people. Anybody else was there to march on Jerusalem to destroy it, right? So the first ones to do something different were the Africans, absolutely.
And you mentioned Abraham's chief servant being a Cushite, Eliezer. And it's at this point that I say that my Hebrew name is Yisrael Eliezer. So maybe if you believe in nominative determinants, maybe I am one of many people who are part of the Ham and Shem, the African and Jewish relationship in the 21st century. Who knows? So, Dumisani, we're living in difficult times here. We're living in a time of war. We're living in a time of shaky relationships, sort of the standards that we had between nations breaking down. So you're a man of optimism, of prayer, and of learning. Where do you think the relationship between African Americans, Black people around the world, Black nations, and the Jewish diaspora in Israel is going?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, you're not wrong. This is two things I've shared with people. There's good news and bad news, but I'll do the bad news first. The bad news is that I don't think we've seen the worst of it in the West. I think that there's more bad to come. It will eventually be okay. It'll become better. But in the Western world, the type of anti-Semitism that we see rising, unfortunately, is going to. We haven't reached its peak yet. And that's the bad. The good news is that this is not the entire story when it comes to Israel and the Jewish people globally. One of the things that we are focused on in our organization, Jonny, is the continual connection of Israel
Great. Yes.
within the Black diaspora, African diaspora, not just in America, not just in Africa, but in the West Indies and the UK. We are literally in talks now about a couple of different events that will happen, one in Africa, both in Africa and in Israel, that will bring, in terms of a conference, Black American leaders and other Africans from the diaspora to Jerusalem for conferences and discussions about moving forward, what this actually looks like, not just Israel, Africa, but in terms of the diaspora as well, our connection with our Jewish brothers and sisters, right? And in Africa as well. So you're talking about Ethiopia and Kenya, and then, of course, in Jerusalem and different parts of the United States. We feel that the most effective way going forward to strengthen the ties between Israel and the Black community and the Jewish community as well in the United States, for example, is by underscoring this Africa connection, which is why we'll be taking Black American delegates to these events so that they can be there and be a part of what is actually happening. I had the pleasure back in March of 23 to attend an Africa Arab Israel summit led by our friends at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. My shout out to my good friend, Dr. Dan Diker there. It was
Yes.
yep,
Yes. I hear
amazing
you.
event. My wife and I were the two only Black Americans in the room. Everybody else was either African or Arab or Israeli. It's very, very powerful. The discussions range from lots of different things, from journalism to counterterrorism to water security, all of these things. And my wife and I sat there with another friend and we said, this is so crucial. When this happens again, there needs to be more Black Americans in the room to see what is happening. This is the future. What is the future? We believe the future is things like the Abraham Accords, Israel's friendship with Arab nations. We believe the future is more of what we're going to see, a Queen of Sheba Accords, more deepening ties within the East. We believe that Black Americans need to have a seat at that table to be a part of that narrative.
Now, you've been married to Valerie for 37 years. Let's look at the stats. You've got 6 children. You've got grandchildren too. And I guess her support is absolutely essential in your journey.
She is that, as our Jewish friends say, that virtuous woman, or I guess that
Really
warrior.
nice.
She
Yes.
enables all of this that I am able to do. This journey that I've been on from the time of the music and pastoring and all those things. Now we've literally known each other all of our lives. We met at 5 years old, so we've known each other all our lives. Of course, we haven't been married that long. That was much later on after that, but our ties go back that far. And so she has seen the entire journey. She's seen the entire metamorphosis. And
Yes.
yes, you're absolutely right. That could not do anything that I do if it were not for my wife. There's no way I could be doing any of these things at all.
We talked earlier on about klezmer and jazz being a relationship which grew out of 20th century America. And there's now a new relationship between Hebrew songs, Hebrew project artists performing gospels with Hebrew and English lyrics. Tell us all about that.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. This is something that was born maybe about less than 30 years ago, just in my hearing some of the Hebrew songs, some of the liturgical songs especially, and then coming up in the gospel tradition, they just began to fuse. This was like most musicians, they would know, actually plan it. It just kind of happens. So at some point, I began to write and create and arrange songs differently that were either the Mika Mocha or the Kadosh or Shema. I began to do those songs. I began to write them on my own and kind of record them. And then at some point, the where I was the music pastor, I began to introduce the songs to the choir, to the congregation, and they worked. It was interesting to me. I've been doing music for a long time, obviously up to that point. But what was interesting to me, obviously, when it comes to singing foreign lyrics, lyrics that you're not, if you don't speak Hebrew, it's easier to sing them than it is to speak them, right? It's like kids can like learn songs and adults can learn songs. So we're singing Kadosh as a call and response, and or the, like I said, the Mika Mocha or the singing the Echa Mocha, whatever. As we're doing those, the people are immediately catching it. Of course, the lyrics on the screen so they can see, okay, it's what's being said, and that's what this means. And it just kind of went from there with our band. These guys are amazing musicians. So coming up with a lot of musicians, and then my son, who was also a musician, we were always surrounded by music, so we were taking them and arranging them on strings and percussion and all of those things. As a matter of fact, we're going to the studio in about a month to do a new version of our Kadosh that we'll probably be performing later on, because we also plan on being in Israel with the THP, the Hebrew Project Artists, later on this year in the fall.
Well, I'm definitely going to get Spotify and check that out, Dumisani, for sure. Now, October the 7th has really propelled your message of unity even more urgently. You're an international speaker. You go all over the world. What is your message today, and how has it changed since 2023?
I think that of the many things, Johnny, would be so I have to be somewhat deliberate here. We were concerned, meaning we, our organization, with the time leading up to it. We didn't predict, we didn't foresee something as horrific as an October the 7th. But what we did see, which was very obvious to us, which caused us a great deal of lament, was a lack of support for Israel within, especially the Christian pro-Israel spaces. Meaning, I'm very specific about this. Um, the eh, the what played out on October the 7th, sadly, there were warning signs about it, particularly when it came to how our government, as I say to my Israeli friends all the time, I'm not Israeli, I'm not African, I'm an American. And I use my voice as an American to what I would call speak truth to power. I love my country. I'm grateful to live in a free nation, but at the same time, in the tradition, I speak truth to power. I try to. We helped and empowered Hamas in ways, the funding of UNRWA, the violating of the Taylor Force Act, which is a law which forbids us to send funding to the Palestinian Authority, knowing that they're going to use it for terrorism. These things help contribute to October 7th. So, in answer to your question, what happened is there was a certain amount of anger that was there for us because we saw some of it as preventable. Could it completely been prevented? Who knows, right? But we saw our role as a government in helping shape and prepare October 7th as unacceptable. So for us, what we've done more so, first and foremost within the Black community, Black pastors, Black leaders, giving the information, telling them about the disinformation that's coming towards our community, why we need to know it, but at the same time, attempting to be proactive in terms of strengthening those ties in those communities so that we can continue to raise up voices that will speak, that will not be silent in the midst of these things that are happening, whether it's the anti-Semitism on our streets or the anti-Israel sentiment that's happening within some of our institutions.
Of course, you only have to doom scroll through social media to see how polarized ideas are, how really stupid some of the comments are. In the digital age, Dumisani, how do you begin to change hearts and minds? Is it more difficult now?
Africa, on Israel, Africa, and Black America, in which we go to, it was a online forum for the last couple of years. Last fall, we launched it as a in-person forum. We started in the Washington, D.C. area, and we will be across the country all throughout this year. And in that forum, we have a small group of about 25 Black pastors and clergy leaders to have the discussion. It's a workshop format. So we are there for several hours. We give them lunch and everything, and we have different speakers, and the speakers include a Sudanese former slave, Simon Dang, who actually will tell them what jihadism happened to him. He'll make the parallels between Sudan and what happened on October 7th in Israel, how it's the same Hamas, is Boko Haram, is Al-Shabaab, it's the same mindset, right, that wants to destroy people of faith, whether it's Christians, whether it's Jews, or even other Muslims being killed in those situations when they are not aligned with this jihadist mentality. And so the reason I mentioned that event, Jonny, is that we invite the pastors, and we don't have any, there's no screening with that. We tell them no questions are off the table. We ask the local pastors there as they're helping us bring other pastors in. We don't, their mindset, right, is not important to us, that they may consider themselves pro-Israel, anti-Israel, somewhere in between, because what we want to have is the dialogue. So each one of our speakers and each one of the subjects that we unpack always follows with it Q&A. We're not just there lecturing them and telling this and the other. We want to hear what's on their minds. We want to know what they're thinking. And I can tell you that what we've experienced to this point, people have come in at the very least skeptical, but left informed, left thanking us for the information, thanking us for explaining things to them that had not been explained. So when it comes to people of divergent viewpoints and everything, we always have it as an open forum so that we can really get to the nit and gritty of what's actually going on. Well, my son said it best a couple of years ago. He was doing an interview, and he said, if IBSI is doing the same thing today, if it's doing the same thing 20 years ago when my sons, he said, my grandsons, are adults, then we failed. If we are still attempting to quote unquote strengthen the ties between the Black and Jewish community in the way that we're doing now, then something is missed. What we envision is a furthering of those ties, but of a building. We're talking about whether it's economic cooperation and coordination, education. We will be taking pastors and leaders to Israel, and then Israelis together in Africa. And we're actually having conversations about how we impact for the good the communities that are there. How do we draw on this Black Jewish synergy, which for centuries has produced so much good, that we are producing institutions and other apparatus that are part of that mindset? What are we doing that's affecting positive change and building? How are we building in those communities and in that way that those institutions being able to withstand, like you said, the next event, what's actually going to happen next, or do we have to build it all over again? The substance of what we are attempting to do is deepen those ties in a way that they will not be shaken or removed because of the next volley of attacks from Hezbollah or whatever Iran is trying to do, and can withstand the disinformation and the volley of those disinformation coming from the media. How do we keep this strong in a way that cannot be waylaid because, as you said, because of the next events that are coming, anticipating what's coming, not in the specifics, but definitely ideologically? How do we make this strong? How do we encourage these African nations to move their embassies to Jerusalem, as has been followed by some of the other nations after the United States do it? And why is that so important? I'll say this last thing. One of the things, for example, that's happening right now, Jonny, in that in the tech world, there are more and more young Black entrepreneurs and programmers and computer, technology, amazing, just wizards from Nigeria, from Kenya. And they are more and more on the scene in Israel, which is the tech hub of the world. It's the second Silicon Valley, and the moment it's going to be the first. We see those types of things as a forward progress where Israel Africa is concerned. We want to continue to build on those types of things to strengthen that in a real sense.
Dumisani Washington, this has been a really wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here on Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Thank you for having me, Jonny. Appreciate it.